Hello friends, in this lecture we're going to implement restarting the game when the player loses. So in order to create this, we need to let the enemy spawner know when the player dies. So that's going to be our first step. In the player we're going to create a delegate and then we're going to broadcast that delegate when the player dies, and then we're going to bind a function to that delegate in the enemy spawner so that we can restart the game. Okay. So let's start by creating that delegate in the player. Up here, we're going to declare a dynamic multicast delegate. We're going to call this f player died delegate, just like that. And then we're going to create a variable here in the player class of this type. And we're going to call this player died delegate. Now all we need to do is to broadcast this delegate when we want to, and that is going to be in the overlap begin function here when the player is dead. So we're going to say, we can get rid of this comment. We're going to say player died delegate dot broadcast. And the way this works is it's exactly the same as what we did up here with the capsule component. The capsule component has this delegate, and we're binding a function to that so that when that delegate is broadcasted, our function is also called. This time though, the only difference is we're also creating the delegate ourselves. So that's the only difference. So that means now we need to do this exact same thing from the enemy spawner. Okay, so let's go there. And we should also create a function so that we can bind to that delegate. And that function is going to be, first of all, it needs to be a U function. And the name is going to be onPlayerDied. A nice name that explains what the function does. Let's create this at the bottom. Just like that. And now we can go into begin play where we get the player and we can say player died delegate, and then we can say add dynamic, and this is going to take in this and then the address of the function, which is going to be enemy spawner on player died. Awesome. This is going to create that connection, and now when the player dies, our function is going to get called. So let's think of what we need to do when the player dies. We want to create, or we want to start a new game. So we want to first of all delete all the enemies that are currently in the game. Then we want to reset the player. And finally, we want to start spawning again. And that also means that we should stop spawning when the player dies, because we don't need to anymore, the game is over. And then we need to do the stuff that I was just talking about. But we don't want to do them immediately. We want to wait a little so that the game feels nicer, because if we do these things immediately, it's not going to feel good. So because of that purpose, we're going to create a timer. And that timer is going to be the restart timer. Restart timer. We'll create a float for this to control how long it's going to take. This time I'll say restart timer duration. And 3 seconds should be fine for this. We're also going to create a function for this on restart timer timeout, just like that. We'll copy and paste this down here. And in here, we're going to have to set this timer. So let's get this code from here to make things easier. And we're going to set the restart timer. We're going to use this function. And this time, this one is not going to loop. So we can simply say false there and restart timer duration, just like that. And once this timer times out, we want to start a new game. We can do all that stuff that I was just talking about here, but we're gonna have to do that twice because we also want to do that stuff here at the start of the game. So that means we should probably turn that into a separate function, and I'm going to call that function start new game. Let's put this down here, and we're going to call this function here instead of start spawning. We'll say start new game, and we're also going to call it down here on the timeout start new game, just like that. Okay. In here, we're going to first of all destroy all the current enemies, and then we're going to reset the player, and then finally we're going to start spawning enemies again, and we're also going to reset the score, but that's something we'll take care of later. But I'm just gonna put the comment here anyways. Reset the score. Okay. So let's start by destroying all the current enemies. To do that, we're going to use a similar function to the one we used up here. This time it's going to be uGameplayStatics get all actors of class. This is going to take in the world, and then it's going to take in the class, which is going to be a enemy static class, and then finally it wants us to give it an array to put all the enemy actors it finds. So we're going to create one ourselves called enemy array, which is going to be a T array of actor pointers called enemy search array, actually, let's say. So this function is exactly like this one up here, only this time it's looking for multiple actors, and it's going to place them into this array instead of returning them. Now we can check if this array has multiple or more than 0 elements in it, and if that's the case, we actually found some enemies. So let's say .num greater than 0. So of course, the first time we play the game up here, when we call start new game, this is going to be false because the first time we play, we don't have any enemies in the game yet. So the first time this isn't going to be a problem, but the second time, third time, we're actually going to delete these enemies, which is what we want. In here, we can simply cast these to be enemies. So enemy, and let's say, what am I doing? We actually need to loop over this array first. Okay. So let's actually loop over this array first, and then we can do the stuff. The loop variable is going to be an actor pointer. Let's say enemy actor. Loop over the enemy search array, just like that. And then in here, we can cast the enemy actor to be an enemy, even though we don't actually have to do that, but just for good measure, maybe we want to do something else with the enemy. Just for good measure, like I said, we'll do this. And let's see. If that worked, and it should work, we can say enemy destroy. Awesome. So this bit of code is going to find all the enemy actors we have in the game, and it's going to destroy all of them. Then we're going to reset the player. So we do have access to the player here. Let's just do a check just for good measure. And then we can simply undo what we did in the player. So in the player at the bottom, we set is alive to false, and we turned off the visibility. So we're basically going to undo these, because now the player is alive again for a new round. We're also going to turn the sprite on, back on, and finally we're going to put the player back in the center position. So we'll say set actor location to 0, 0, 0. Okay, that should be enough to reset the player. We're not going to be able to do the score in this lecture, So let's do this part, which is going to be spawning enemies again, because down here we stopped spawning. So we can actually go ahead and just call start spawning, and that would be enough. But again, just for good game feel, I want to do this a couple of seconds after the game starts. I don't want the game, or I don't want the enemies to start spawning immediately. I want there to be a small delay, which I think is going to feel nicer. For this purpose, we're going to create another timer, which is going to be the game start timer. We can create a variable for this as well, so let's just might as well do that as well. We did it for the rest of the timers, and this timer might feel sad. So game start timer, and I think for this I will say 2 seconds. Okay, and let's also create the function. On game start timer, timeout. We're going to put this down here. And this is just simply going to call start spawning. And here all we need to do is we need to set the timer. So let's say game start timer. And we'll say this function. It's not going to loop. And it's going to use the game start timer duration. Okay, so this should be all good. Let's do a final recap so that we can understand the flow of this. In the player, we now have a delegate. Don't worry if you get these red lines. These will usually go away after you compile the game once and then open back up. Now we have this delegate called the player died delegate, and we're broadcasting this delegate in overlap begin when the player dies. In the enemy spawner, we connected a function to this delegate called onPlayerDied, and that means this onPlayerDied function will get called when the player broadcasts that delegate. And when that happens, we're going to stop spawning because the game is over, and then we're going to set the restart timer for good game feel, for a little bit of a delay. And then in the timeout function, we're going to call start new game. And in the start new game function, first of all, we're going to destroy all the current enemies we have in the game. And then we're going to reset the player. We're going to place it back into the center, and we're going to start showing the sprite again. And then finally, we're going to set the game start timer, which is simply going to start spawning again, just for good game feel. Okay, with this, we should be able to play the game over and over again. Let's go into Unreal, exit out of it, rebuild the game, and then we can test this. Okay, now we can go ahead and test the game. Now there should be a 2-second delay when we start the game before we start spawning enemies, and as you can see, that's working. Let's also see if the restart is going to work. And as you can see, it does. After we lose, we wait 3 seconds and the game is reset. The player is back in the center and we can see it again. And the is alive boolean is also going to be true. Let's also maybe spawn more enemies to better see if the enemies are getting destroyed properly or not. So I'm going to put the spawn time to be 0.5. Play the game again. And we're going to have a bunch of enemies in the scene. And you can see that they all get destroyed. Awesome. We can also see that in the outliner as well, obviously. And if you don't like these times, if you don't like these values, you can always change them. That's why we made them edit anywhere. But yeah, with that, we're going to end this lecture. Now we can play our game forever, over and over again. If you liked it, thank you, I guess, and maybe leave a like. And I hope to see you in the next one. Take care.